Hello everyone, how you going? And welcome to how Canada just got a land border with Denmark. Something that sounds completely ridiculous considering they were two separate countries, but I guess if there's a will, there's a way.
Last month, the world's geography just changed forever. Canada and Denmark are two totally different nations located thousands of miles apart from one another on different continents separated by the entire Atlantic Ocean.
Yes.
But in one significant way, the two nations share one major geographic similarity. Until just last month, in June of 2022, they were two of only 17 countries across the world that shared a land border with just a single other country. The others being Brunei's single border with Malaysia, the Dominican Republic and Haiti each bordering the other on the island of Hispaniola, the Gambia that's surrounded by Senegal, the Republic of Ireland and the United Kingdom each bordering the other on the island of Ireland, Monaco surrounded by France, Vatican City and San Marino each surrounded by Italy, Lesotho surrounded by South Africa, Papua New Guinea stuck with Indonesia on one island, and Timor-Leste stuck with them on another island,
True.
Portugal stuck on the Iberian Peninsula with Spain, Qatar stranded on a peninsula blocked by Saudi Arabia, and South Korea stuck on another peninsula blocked in by North Korea.
That's a lot of different countries. I was expecting that list to be a little bit shorter than that, considering it went, oh, only a few, and then there was like 20 or something. I mean, looking at it, it certainly makes sense. You know, Denmark is just a massive peninsula that's connected to the rest of mainland Europe, and then Canada is just surrounded by the USA on all sides. Besides, when Greenland becomes involved into it, then Denmark is actually part of Greenland. Or actually, I guess it's the other way around, because Greenland is owned by Denmark or is part of its entire kingdom. But we can clearly see that there is a channel, a gap, whatever you want to call it, between the two countries, and so obviously it can't be there unless the sea has suddenly just dropped out from underneath it. I don't know, a kilometer, however deep it is, but I just don't see that exactly happening.
Until last month, Denmark's only land border was with Germany to their immediate south, while Canada's only land borders were with the United States across the south and the west with Alaska. But despite being located thousands of miles away on two different continents, Canada and Denmark are a lot closer than you probably initially thought. Because as of the 11th of June 2022, they each officially border each other by land. And that means that they've each removed themselves from the already small list of countries that only border a single other country.
I feel as though all of a sudden they have just made a question that could just destroy students all around the world. You know, they ask, oh, how many borders or land borders does Canada have? It'll be like, oh, trying to count in your head, go, no, yeah, it must only be one. But then you might be thinking, oh, okay, is Alaska a separate country? No, it's not. But is it then 3, 2, or 1? And you're just going to be having people's minds melt.
But how can a country in Europe and another in North America even border each other by land? Well, it's because their border is a very tiny one and it's located right here in the literal middle of nowhere on a small, barren, uninhabited rock of an island known as Hans Island. Today, Denmark and Canada both split the island roughly 60-40 respectively across a border that's only a tad longer than 1,200 meters. This is what makes them both technically bordering nations now. But for decades before just last month, the issue of who between them actually owned this insignificant and pointless island was an unresolved territorial dispute that generated one of modern history's friendliest, good-natured, and wackiest conflicts known as the Whiskey War.
Before he goes on and explains it a little bit more, I just want to know what is going on with this island, because look at it, there is nothing there. Why are they even wanting it in the first place? Surely it can just remain unclaimed land. Look at that, it's absolutely tiny, and it's also colder than what they originally showed. I mean, it certainly makes sense, and sadly we're not getting the entire channel being covered. It's just been washed out in ocean blue, but you can see how icy it is across that whole thing. I mean, from the little bit of an edge and surrounding the island that we can see, it doesn't look as though you could walk across it, but maybe in the middle, the absolute middle of winter, you could be able to walk across it and actually get to this island, not by a boat. And then tracing around the whole outside, I don't know what's what. I guess that's probably land as well. Here we go, just a bit of this. How many? It's 5k's around, no, 4k's around, but 1.13 square k's. So yeah, I can understand how you could split an island like that in half, and I'm now also wondering, is it the shortest border in the world? Because that's not very long.
It was a very rare territorial dispute for both nations, and particularly for Canada, who also shares the longest international border in the world with the United States further to the south and the west, stretching for nearly 9,000 kilometers in length. From a more European perspective, that is a length of border equivalent to the distance between Portugal and Bangladesh. But despite this massive length, the border between the United States and Canada has been generally calm and peaceful for most of the past 2 centuries, with few disagreements. The only notable disagreement that they have over land today is the maritime border between the two nations off the coast of the US state of Maine and the Canadian province of New Brunswick. Here, the Canadians insist that the maritime border between themselves and the Americans is here, while the Americans, conversely, insist that the maritime border is actually here.
Come on, people, look at that. Surely someone can just give it and go, okay, well, I guess it is what it is. Especially because no one is living there. It's the middle of the ocean, so I can understand how you want to get it right for boats, but come on, in the grand scheme of things, there is no population anywhere impacted by that.
It doesn't really matter all that much, save for a couple small islands that are stuck in between the two competing claims here.
Oh, really?
Machias Seal Island, home to a single controversial Canadian-built lighthouse and visited often by American tourist boats, and the even smaller and insignificant North Rock. Legally speaking, both the United States and Canada maintain overlapping claims of sovereignty to both of these uninhabited and meaningless islands, which means that they sort of just exist in this weird legal gray zone. The final specks of the North American continent north of the Rio Grande that haven't yet been settled. But somehow, even less significant and yet more controversial than these little islands is Hans Island, which for nearly half a century existed as a diplomatic thorn in the side of Canadian-Danish relations, with each claiming the entirety of the island for themselves.
Why would you even bother? Honestly, like I said, there is nothing there, people. Just get rid of it. Just go, okay, take one for the team. You guys can have it. I'm just going to scooch around the outside of it instead of cutting straight through it, and then you'll be sweet. You don't even have to worry about either side's just arguing back.
The conflict dates back to Canada's control over Ellesmere Island and Denmark's control over Greenland, and the narrow Nares Strait that flows in between them. For most of history, the exact maritime border between the Canadians and the Danes here was legally undefined and generally assumed to be the strait itself. Because, well, it's a frozen wasteland where nobody actually lives permanently. The closest actual permanently inhabited settlements are Alert in Canada 198 kilometers away, and Sararapaluk in Greenland 349 kilometers away.
Wow, that is actually a lot further than I expected it to. I guess the scale's completely off. I expected it to be really stretched because it's up north, and so you just go, oh, that must be only be 30k, but look at that, 300k and 100k. And in terms of him saying the strait was originally perceived to be the border itself, certainly makes sense, makes it very easy, but then what do you do with those islands in the middle is where I guess it became complicated and people just started creeping further and further across until they just faced off against each other.
The closest actual permanently inhabited settlements are Alert in Canada 198 kilometers away, and Sararapaluk in Greenland 349 kilometers away, and they are collectively home to less than 150 people. This area was simply never really geopolitically important until in the 1970s, when people started figuring out that there could be valuable things like oil and natural gas in the area. And so in 1972, a team of both Canadians and Danes began working on the first legally defined maritime boundary between each of their big Arctic islands. They established 127 points of latitude and longitude across the Nares Strait, roughly in the center between Ellesmere and Greenland, and then drew a line between all of these points to formally mark out the border. But there was a small anomaly. Around here, the strait is only about 35 kilometers wide, and this speck of rock called Hans Island is pretty much dead in the center of it, which is why both the Canadian and Danish surveying teams each claimed it for their own respective countries.
Of course they did. Honestly, the whole thing just sounds like they're being a bit cheeky, going, oh, they won't even notice. It's just a tiny island. Who cares? We'll take it. They won't take it. And then that's both sides saying the same thing. I mean, I'm a bit confused at how you can go 10, 20, 30, 40, all the way up to 100, nice and compacted, and then 110, and then 120 all the way up there. So that would mean there was only 9 points throughout this entire 300 plus kilometer area. And then you got hundreds down here within a 300 kilometer area.
Unable to come to any kind of agreement, the 1970s era maritime treaty between them simply left the border in the Nares Strait between points 122 and 123 blank, with Hans Island itself an undefined territory in the middle. They basically just decided to kick the issue of ownership over the island down the road for someone else to figure out at a later time. It's just that nobody at the time probably expected that a later time would mean about half a century and the collective efforts of 26 different foreign ministers. For decades in between then and 2022, Canadian and Danish soldiers took alternating turns visiting the island and raising their own respective flags, taking down the other's flag, and placing a bottle of their favorite national liquor. In 1984...
What? That is so petty. Like I said, they just could have completely left it alone, taken one for the team, go, all right, if it's going to be like this, we're just going to step back. We don't care. It's a 1 square kilometer piece of land in the middle of nowhere with nothing but ice surrounding it. We just do not care. We're not bothered to come all the way up here into the middle of nowhere to take down your flag and put up ours. Not happening over and over and over again.
For decades in between then and 2022, Canadian and Danish soldiers took alternating turns visiting the island and raising their own respective flags, taking down the other's flag, and placing a bottle of their favorite national liquor. In 1984, a group of Canadian soldiers visited by helicopter raised up their flag and left a bottle of Canadian Club whiskey for the Danes who they knew would come by later. And sure enough, the Danes did, by respectfully taking down and folding up the Canadian flag, raising the Danish flag, and replacing the Canadian Club whiskey with a bottle of their own Danish schnapps, along with a sign which simply read, "Welcome to the Danish island." This humorous process process kept going back and forth for decades until it got a bit more contentious and a little less friendly in 2005. In that year, the Canadian Defense Minister at the time, Bill Graham, decided to set foot on the island personally to raise up the Canadian flag and assert his nation's sovereignty to it.
Wow, well that photo certainly paints this guy in a very threatening kind of light, and considering he went, nah, stuff this is finally going to be ours. I'm not taking any other excuses from it. I'm raising the flag myself and it's being permanent, which is completely juxtaposed to this one when the Danes went up there and just standing there in their coat just with a big old smile on. But it really does make me wonder what they did with the flag each time, because he said that they took it down and folded it up, but does that mean they left it there just under a pile of rocks or something so it doesn't blow away, or what did they actually do with it? Or did they actually have to bring a new flag every time and the other people took it home, because then they would just have a collection of another country's flag? I mean, by the sound of it, they would also have a collection of, I guess, probably empty whiskey bottles by now as well, of which I do love the fact that it turned into a rolling tradition where it's like, okay, we're going to be taking down your flag now, but at least here's a present for next time you come and take down our flag. It's just such a lovely back and forward that easily could have been broken by someone forgetting it, someone not caring, someone just taking the bottle and running, whatever it may be. So it is nice to see that these two countries, even though they were feuding together just over the same tiny plot of land, were also just able to be considerate and go, okay, here you go.
Just 5 days after his visit, the Danish government filed an official protest to the Canadian government, while the Danish deputy premier of Greenland publicly stated that Hans Island had been occupied by Canada. Tensions were at an all-time high, and the Danes decided to send over this fearsome warship to the island to reassert Danish control. But then, the prime ministers of both countries began to call for peace and calm, and both the Canadian and Danish foreign ministers agreed to meet thousands of miles away from Hans Island in New York City to discuss the terms of diplomacy. During that meeting, they essentially agreed to solve the matter diplomatically, but they each continued insisting that Hans Island was rightfully theirs in entirety. So, in practice, it didn't really go anywhere, although the Danish foreign minister did agree that he would cancel his ship's mission to the island, and that he wouldn't take down the Canadian flag and rehoist the Danish flag.
Oh wow, that is actually a big deal, because you're basically surrendering to the other country, going, okay then, I will not take down your flag, I will not dispute your claim to the throne, and even though I don't agree with it, I am not interested in conflict anymore, I will actually take back my battleship, which is an awesome little battleship. Where is it? Look at that thing. I can only imagine it's somewhat an icebreaker as well, just in case there's any icebergs floating around, but look at it, it's tiny, I love it.
At least for a while. Beginning in 2012, there were renewed calls within both countries to solve the issue by simply splitting the island in half. And then, 6 years later from there, in 2018, they each announced a new joint task force to settle the border dispute once and for all, which was finally officially agreed upon another 4 years later, on the 10th of June, 2022, with roughly 60% of the island going to Denmark by extension of Greenland's own control, and the other 40% going to Canada's Nunavut territory. And
why would you even bother doing a 60-40 split? Just do a 50-50. I mean, I guess they agreed to it, so it is what it is, but really you had to go and do 60-40 just to spite the Canadians, or I don't even know how you would manage that.
And pretty much the only reason why it took so long to actually solve was that it was actually pretty convenient politically for both nations to continue keeping it unsolved. Canada and Denmark have been allies with one another for a very long time, and have enjoyed friendly relations for decades, going back to them each being founding members of the NATO alliance in 1949. If you pay closer attention to the actual dates when the Canadians and Danes made their highly publicized visits to the island, raising their flags and leaving behind their national liquor, they generally always took place soon before election season in each country. It was an easy method for both governments to just kick up some patriotic feelings and sentiments right before an election that literally had no risk or downside at all.
That is ridiculous. The fact that these people are just using it as a political handball, just back and forward, just going, oh yeah, look, there's this thing that I want to advertise our country with. Oh yes, okay, we'll just go and swap it around again. This poor little island is just being treated so poorly. It's going, please just someone claim me or just leave me alone. And something that I did notice is that this flag is solid. I don't think I have ever seen a solid flag before. I mean, it makes sense. You're not going to have it kind of get caught or ripped up or anything like that. And as long as you put it on some kind of a swivel so it doesn't get blown over or break it, then it makes a lot of sense. And I guess the Danish have done the other option to give it a bit more life expectancy. I can only imagine these photos are a few years apart, but they've cut out the end of it so it's got a bit more of a wispy tail, a light tail, so it doesn't just grab the air and get ripped down. And also, look at how massive all of these guys are. That is ridiculous. If I was them, I would just clip up my flag up the top, remove the ropes, and then you basically got a permanent flag, because I don't think the Canadians are going to be as tall as the Danish.
Both Copenhagen and Ottawa had obvious political incentives to keep dragging out the irrelevant conflict for decades, especially once it was discovered that the island didn't have any resources, and any potential oil or gas nearby would probably be too expensive to drill and economically unviable. Hans Island was always politically valuable to keep contested, but then in 2022, it suddenly became politically valuable valuable instead to actually solve it. In February, the Russians shocked much of the world when they decided to settle their border disputes with Ukraine by launching an enormous and bloody invasion with hundreds of thousands of troops, culminating in the biggest war seen on the European continent since the end of World War II, that has already caused tens of thousands of violent deaths and millions of refugees, accompanied by a newfound global sense of uncertainty and fear for the future not seen since the end of the First Cold War. What better way for the governments of Canada and Denmark, two NATO allies, to place a spotlight on Russia's own military aggression in Europe by solving their own long-standing territorial dispute over Hans Island peacefully?
Well, geez, there is certainly a lot to unpack there, but the entire thing does make sense from a political point of view. You know, you're going, okay, there's a lot of turmoil in this world at the moment. Let's just show that we can peacefully, like he said, settle this dispute that has been going on for too long, for goodness sake. You know, we've spent probably hundreds of millions of dollars just sending military up there back and forth for the last 50 years. And so by showcasing that we can settle these disputes peacefully, we don't have to just go to war with one another over a 1 square kilometer island. You know, we can bring each other wine and spirits, whatever they are. If nothing else, it is just great advertising for both countries, going, oh wow, look at how proactive and how positive they were within that entire exchange. Let's just do that again, please.
The matter is all the more pressing to the Arctic members of NATO like Canada and Denmark, along with the United States, Iceland, and Norway, because in recent years, the Russians have been rapidly remilitarizing their region of the Arctic with airfields, radar stations, highly increased troop deployments, and even the presence of nuclear missiles and torpedoes.
Wow.
As the Arctic continues to warm throughout this century, it will become one of the greatest arenas of conflict in the new 21st century Cold War between NATO on the one side and the Russians and Chinese over on the other. And looking forward into this inevitable future, keeping an unresolved territorial dispute open between two NATO allies within the Arctic, no matter how friendly and cordial, would have been an unwise decision geopolitically.
Yeah, it just doesn't make sense, especially when it is simple as just going, okay, you take this half, I'll take this half, sweet, okay, done. Especially when you see a map like this and you go, oh geez, all of those airfields or at least a military base, like that is a lot of presence that is just building all up in this Arctic Circle, and honestly, I had no idea. You know, I'm just chilling at the top right, but then just curved to the other side of the Earth, and I had no idea that any of this was even a thing, but it makes sense. You know, there is so much area up there that is, for some good reasons, a little bit inhospitable, but also if you can make it hospitable for people, oh, it's just golden.
And so, the time had finally come for Denmark and Canada to solve it once and for all, and formally become neighbors by land as well as by sea.
And it might only be a 500-meter long border or a 1 kilometer long border, and yes, you might have been able to travel 15 kilometers and go to either country if that island wasn't there, but it just makes a massive difference and showcases, like I said, how you were able to resolve these disputes eventually. Even though it did take about 50 years, at least they eventually got there, not using any kind of military might besides Denmark sending a ship up there. I think it was more so just to check it out and not to shoot down the Canadian flag with a battleship or anything like that. That's a little bit too over the top for this kind of conflict, because like they said, it was the Whiskey Wars, which in reality wasn't a war at all. You know, the fact that they were bringing spirits from their own country and then taking down the flag and folding it up for the other country definitely showcases there was a lot of love and respect there. There was just orders being given, and so they would make the trek all the way up to the middle of nowhere to just do a menial task. But hey, like I said, it has finally been resolved, and that can only be a good thing, because the more that people and countries get along, the better it is. You know, we don't need conflict, we certainly don't want conflict, and even though there is nothing there and it is kind of a completely worthless island, it just showcases that there are other ways to tackle the same problem. But anyway, in saying that, I reckon I'm going to call it there. So thank you for watching this video. If you did enjoy it, feel free to do the algorithmic things down below. Also, if this is the first video of mine that you're watching, then make sure to go check out any other ones I've done. Also, make sure to go check out the original video down in the description below, or hey, maybe even just want to consider subscribing so that you don't miss out on one of these in the future. But all in all, have a good one and see ya.